when we look at natural law, we're saying something that you cannot deny another person their right to live, for example, or their right to be able to support themselves, their right to participate in what we say are institutions of the common good. It's because we're human beings. And the question of, where do rights come from?
Here we go. Welcome to a special edition of the Focusing Way podcast. I'm your host, David Battistella. We call these special editions The Way is Love. Find The Focusing Way on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and our website, thefocusingway.com. Today on The Way is Love on the Focusing Way podcast, we're talking global economics. It's a big subject and we're mostly hearing about it through the sloganeering of our age. Put up your hand if you've heard the words "build back better" more often than you wanted to in the last 2 years. I know I feel I have. Perhaps even more so, we have been hearing these other 3 words which promise a wonderful future: the Great Reset. While working folks toil away at jobs and seek out the ordinary pleasures in life, a group of people meet in Switzerland once a year to present ideas and ultimately decide what the world should be like. My guests today are Michael D. Greaney and Don K. Browhawn. They're the co-authors of a book called The Greater Reset: Reclaiming Personal Sovereignty Under Natural Law. The book presents counter-arguments on the Great Reset with a greater plan and one that considers past teachings with historical reflection and forward thinking. This book will give you a history of the writings, ideas, and intellectual thinking that influences how we view and perceive economics today, with the important view to what the role of faith, morality, virtue, and the natural law plays in how we organize our lives and our social and economic structures. The Greater Reset asks, must we simply accept a world where systemic poverty, racism, and war are inevitable, unavoidable, and irreparable? Or can we turn the present crisis into an opportunity to reset the system back to universal principles and absolute values of natural law? And joining me now are the authors of The Greater Reset, Michael D. Greaney and Don K. Browhawn, co-authors of this lovely book. Welcome to The Way is Love and the Focusing Way podcast.
It's great
Thank you. Good to be here.
I'm just going to start with a quote here from early on in the book, and we'll get into the first question. So, quote, an Oxfam report entitled Public Good or Private Wealth, presented at the 2019 World Economic Forum conference, stated that 2,200 billionaires worldwide saw their wealth grow by 12%, while the poorest half saw its wealth fall by 11%. While never explicitly stating that this is an objective, the World Economic Forum has become associated with the phrase, quote, you will own nothing and you will be happy, unquote. Thus, the Great Reset fails to empower economically every person. Instead, it concentrates power in the government and in the private elite, close quote. What does the title of your book, The Greater Reset, mean?
I'm going to take a first shot at this. I think the fastest way to summarize it is in the subtitle, and that is the Greater Reset is how we reclaim personal sovereignty under natural law. Now, what does that mean? What our book gets into are 3 areas that the Great Reset and the WEF, with its proposals, have taken on one approach to dealing with evident problems. I think few would argue that we have serious problems with poverty, with war, with what's happening to the environment. And the question is, what is the role of the human being in all this, the individual person? How do we solve these problems in a way that does not extinguish the dignity of each human person? And what mechanisms do we have that are within a context that respects human dignity, but also connects each of us, wherever we are, whoever we are on this planet, to these various mechanisms of power. And by power, We mean that ability to create change or do something. And really the focal point then is, how do we solve these problems? And there is one way that's proposed, and then there's another. And I think you've hit on just the point in the Oxfam report. When you see this growing disparity during a time where really the world economy stopped for a moment during the pandemic, that you saw a few people getting wealthier and wealthier while most people were losing income and getting poorer. So why did that happen? And what do we do about it? That's one of the big questions in our book.
Yeah. Michael?
Yeah, if I were to summarize, I'd say that the Great Reset is it's a well-intentioned effort to address some very serious problems in a way that actually would make them worse. But it doesn't address the underlying problems. The Greater Reset seeks to solve the underlying problems, identify the right principles that support and defend human dignity, and then apply them in a consistent manner with human nature and, of course, with Catholic social teaching based on human nature.
Yeah. For those of you who can't see the video and are listening to this on iTunes, Michael has a wonderful sign behind him that states very plainly, own or be owned. I just wanted to put that in for our audio listeners. Fulton J. Sheen is scattered throughout the book, and he talks about the great inversion, where he states that, and I'll just do another quote from the book here, quote, "We expect God to serve us, and we are not present to serve God. There is an alteration in the seat of authority. In the beginning, God made man in his own image and likeness. In the 20th century, man makes God in his own image and likeness." So we'll go into a few of the Catholic questions, but why is this book, or why would it be of interest to Catholics?
Well, primarily, most people seem unaware. By most people, I mean most people, not just most Catholics, that human nature is the basis for society, not collective humanity, not an elite, and it's certainly not God-given. Society is a human construct. And being a human construct, if it's to be consistent with human dignity and help support it and maintain it, it has to be consistent with human nature. Now, why would this be of interest to Catholics? Well, Catholic social teaching developed in the early 19th century in direct response to certain new theories, new things as they were called back in 1834, that were contrary to human nature. To be honest, these people were looking at some very serious problems back in the late 18th, early 19th century and saying, what can we do about it? Mm-hmm. And what they decided to do was toss out everything based on human nature and institute something that they figured was more consistent with collective humanity or with an elite of humanity, not for every single human person. They called it human dignity, but no, they meant dignity of the collective or the dignity of an elite. The elitists we today call conservatives and Catholics, and the collectivists we call socialists or liberals. But both of them bypass something that, for example, Alexis de Tocqueville saw in the early 19th century in the United States with a few glaring problems, but it was the dignity and sovereignty of the human person. And that's what's consistent with human dignity. And thus that is what would interest every Catholic, with the inherent respect for the dignity of the human person that underlies Catholic social teaching.
Yes, Don, do you have something on that? Yeah, come on in.
Yes, I must confess I'm not Catholic, but my thinking has been greatly influenced by one of the co-founders of our organization, the Center for Economic and Social Justice, and that was Father William Ferree, who he died in 1985, but his thinking on Pope Pius XI's concepts of social justice and the act of social justice create an overall framework within which we can look at things like even economic justice, look at our institutions, and look at when either the institutions that are supposed to serve all of us, each of us, when they are defective and they block participation, equal access by every member of society. At that point, what do you do? And prior to Pius XI, who identified a specific act of social justice, meaning this personal responsibility each of us individually, but as members of groups, has to take care of the social order and the common good, which they defined as this network of institutions, which could include government, corporations, tax laws, banking systems, whose purpose, under this idea of, if we start with the idea of natural law and the sovereignty of the human person under God, then we have to see any institution that's not a God-created human being, as those institutions are invisible tools to help us develop, and what Mike will explain later is that concept of virtue, to become more fully human. Mm-hmm. So what Father Ferri explained about Pius XI was that he showed that we have the means to correct our institutions, but we must do that coming together with other people. We must organize, we must have correct principles in order to understand where the flaw is and how to correct it. And that it's one of the, I guess, a litmus test to see whether an institution is performing the way it's supposed to, is you look at whether every individual human person has equal access to participate in that institution. And so the idea of natural law comes in, that as human persons, now this is not looking at superficial differences in terms of our talents, or maybe our intelligence, for example, or whatever, is our tastes. Those are going to be unique to us. We are unique creations. However, what is it that is universal to all of us as human beings? And so from my perspective, the universality of these concepts is, and that's Catholic with a small c, is very, very important for everyone in the world to understand these. These are for each of us because we are all human persons.
Yeah. And that's the center of the book. The message ends up, we keep coming back to the dignity of the human person. And that sort of gets left out in some way because people take positions or they get dug in. And we see that through many centuries of this discussion. One of the things I wanted to ask is, the Great Reset sort of leaves in place the current political and financial power structures. So why would we trust the people who created this flawed system to correct it?
We wouldn't. I mean, they have a vested interest in keeping things the way they are. Mm-hmm. What they're overlooking, and what, with all their good intentions with the Great Reset and with all these other programs, I mean, socialism has good intentions, capitalism has good intentions, but they're leaving out, the great question. You see it a lot in cartoons. What is the meaning and purpose of life? Mm. And people spend hours debating this. I thought it's very simple. The meaning and purpose of life is to become more fully human, to develop more fully as a human person, or as Aristotle put it, to become virtuous. Virtue itself means humanness. Mm-hmm. So as you conform more closely to your own nature, which is analogously complete with that of God, and we can get into that really deep if you like, but as we conform more closely to our human nature, our true selves, and we become virtuous. We become more fully human. Everybody is human and is human in the same way. But we become more fully human as we become virtuous, and we become less fully human if we become vicious. So that's respect for human dignity doesn't mean that the greatest good for the greatest number, or let's take care of everybody's material needs and forget about what they need to develop as true human beings to meet their final end, whatever it may be, as they define it, we have to consider the respect for the dignity of every single human being and the opportunity and means to become more fully human.
Yeah.
Yes. And I just like to comment, since David, you noticed the sign behind Mike saying own or be owned. And that relates very much to the question of what do we mean by human dignity? And what is the means by which people may enhance their dignity or protect it in order to live more fully, to develop? And it's one thing to talk about human dignity as, yes, this is something inherent in each of us that was not given to us by society. It was not given to us by an elite. It was given to us as human persons created by God. Once we get into a social context, which we are immediately when we're born. I mean, we're assuming that we're not born on a desert island. We live within very social groupings, and ultimately we are all connected to each other on this planet. The question, though, is how can we have power over our own lives? And you bring up a good question. Why should we trust these people who, they're part of a system which is, it's really creating more and more problems for, most of humanity. And it's not to say that they're necessarily evil people. They are doing well by the present system. The question is whether the rest of us feel that this system is a fair one, that we can expect, for the future to be better for not only ourselves, but children and grandchildren. Right. And the problem is this system, this human creation, is one which excludes most people. And it excludes people from the most basic level of human existence, which is their economic needs. And no one likes to talk about economics. Their eyes glaze over if you say the word economics. But, most of our waking hours are caught up in economics in one way or another. So what we're saying in this book is that we need principles to redesign these systems, particularly those relating to money and how new capital, these productive tools, are brought into existence, but also our connection, each of us, our connection to the processes of growth and the processes of financing those growth. If we are not included within that stream of financing and that access to future capital being formed, we are going to be stuck in the position of, at best, wage slaves, wage serfs. And you can be a highly paid wage serf. But the point is, if you are vulnerable, if you lose your job, you may be making millions. If you lose your job and then you don't have a means of earning any additional income because maybe either the boss didn't like you or a robot replaced you, then what is your recourse? You're going to need the government to give you some kind of, social economic sustenance. And that's a very dangerous thing, because you are then at that point at the mercy of those who do have the power, who have the economic really control over the levers of production and distribution and consumption. We need to be sovereigns of our own economic fate, our existence. So that's own or be owned is very much tied into the idea of human dignity. We must have the means to be able to exercise it and grow it. And that is the focus in our book, is what is the role of property as it relates to natural law, and what is the role of money? Because that has become so messed up.
Yeah.
No one knows, what is this money, whether it's, Bitcoin or whether it's the money of any nation on earth right now. Mm-hmm. For example, the US dollar, what stands behind it? It's the debt of the federal government.
Yeah.
Well, what does that mean? It's not based on real things of value that will be exchanging. So that's part of the book also.
I think people have that sense too of a falseness. Like, even the term fiat currency makes people kind of go, well, I don't really know what that means or anything. But people are awakening to the fact that there's kind of a falseness to the entire system. I like to look at it in terms of superiority and inferiority. And rather than power, I like to look at things as people are either superior, and in the moment you have in any relationship superiority, you start to create an imbalance between those two peoples or the person in that institution or their government or whatever thing. And there's a term in Italian, it's called maleducato. And I don't really know how to exactly translate it. One person, you could say it means ignorant, you could say it means misinformed, you could say uneducated, or also just this whole notion that you've been educated poorly or poorly educated. And as I went through the book, it came to me, I was like, well, this is a book and it's written in English and I have the ability to read it. And, just that the very notion in our world as it stands today, that assumes many things. Like the fact that I can even read your book means I have a certain education and that I'm able to read, So it's part of the problem, we have like massively more people educated, but now it's like it seems like the educated or the overeducated, which can lead to this thing of superiority, which leads to we, the educated, are going to meet in Davos and put together the plan for the world. Because I just wanted to put that idea of superiority to each of you.
Well, I hadn't thought about it, but yeah, I could say that. Maleducato, it's almost, I would say that is exactly the right word, because what you have, one of the difficulties we have of communicating this whole new paradigm is that people have been educated and even very well educated using bad principles and in the wrong paradigm. So that when you talk even about money, they have the wrong idea about money. They even have the wrong idea about property. They think it's the thing. Whereas property is actually the natural, absolute right every single human being has to own something, what the Catholic Church calls the generic right of dominion. But it's also the limited and socially determined rights of property, use, what somebody may do with something, which the Church calls the universal destination of all goods. Poorly educated people look at those terms and think they mean socialism. The generic right of dominion, universal destination of all goods, that means we all get to use everything and nobody can own anything. No, it means exactly the opposite.
And many Catholics would assume that Catholicism is a very socialist by nature faith, but maybe you would want to correct me on that or put out there what it's really founded on.
I wouldn't correct you on that. The popes would. That's their job.
Right.
But in the book, we don't get into the faith-based aspects of Christianity or of anything else. It is strictly natural law.
Yes.
But then, of course, Jesus was both true God and true man, so that's fully applicable. Because as man, he obeyed the laws that pertain to being human. Mm-hmm. I remember when I was in catechism way back in the 4th or 3rd grade or some such thing, we had these little pictures that showed Jesus being God and Jesus being man, true God and true man. I thought, okay, it was kind of dumbed down a bit, but it has to do with we as human beings and our being made in God's image and likeness. So it does relate to God, but it's not faith-based, it's reason-based. One of the biggest mistakes, the first modernist who gave Félicité Robert de Lamennais, he wasn't labeled the first modernist till about 30 years after he died. But his idea was basically socialism. And he exaggerated papal infallibility and claimed that we can't know the natural law or knowledge of God's existence by reason. We can only know it by faith. Socialism, whether it believes in a God or not, is very faith-based. Frankly, so is modernism. Mm-hmm. This is why the Catholic Church in 1869 formally defined the primacy of the intellect in all matters pertaining to natural law and knowledge of God's existence. Now, to qualify that, the Catholic Church does not teach that God's existence has been proven by reason only that it can be. If it has been, that's a matter of opinion. So you can, but the primacy of the will, faith, that pertains to supernatural, faith-based matters. And the thing that throws so many people is that faith may be higher than reason, and reason may be provable where faith is not, but they cannot contradict each other. They necessarily go together.
Yeah.
So that if you really want to understand what we're talking about in the greater reset, well, strictly speaking, you don't have to have any faith-based beliefs at all. But you do have to acknowledge that they exist. But you do have to understand that we're basing our argument on reason, and that we believe that God's existence has been proven reasonably, and that the natural law can be demonstrated by reason.
Right.
Now, if you want to talk about God, well, then you're getting into the faith-based area. We try not to get into that.
No, rather than get into faith, I would put the question more like, can any system be reset without first considering God or including God in that reset?
Well, given that we believe that human nature comes from God or is created by God, the answer is necessarily no. Now, how you conceive God, that we can get into endless arguments about that. But
no,
that
we don't
there
need to
is
go there.
that there is an absolute source of all creation. You do have to get into that and acknowledge it. Otherwise, you have to acknowledge we came from someplace. We didn't. If we didn't come from anywhere, we're not here.
Right.
Right.
Don,
And I think another way of looking at what you just asked is, are there certain principles that apply to every person, no matter what the circumstance, even no matter what period of history we live in, that are true because we're human beings? And we believe that rights, for example, they're not given to us by the state. That was something Thomas Hobbes had, this concept of the immortal God, the government, that human beings have sort of given over their powers to this entity, the state, and the state will decide, what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do. When we look at natural law, we're saying something that you cannot deny another person their right to live, for example, or their right to be able to support themselves, their right to participate in what we say are institutions of the common good. It's because we're human beings. And the question of, where do rights come from? To me personally, it begs the question, well, if it's not human beings, if it's not society, if it's not the government, where did these things come from? And how is it that something like a natural law, how do we know that's real? Well, what I would say is that you can see consistent sort of consequences when certain basic principles and laws are violated. How do human beings react? They may react in, to different degrees, and certain things may cause them to react, whereas other things don't. But essentially, I would say human beings, they just naturally tend towards survival, self-preservation. They also do not like to be controlled by others. Now, this is, healthy human beings, okay?
Yeah.
And they want to be treated fairly. Now, whether they realize and are educated to understand that to be treated fairly, you have to treat other people fairly, and the system has to treat people fairly. And it's in the question of systems. You raised the point about miseducation. And that is exactly the problem that we're dealing with now. Mike used the word paradigm, and paradigm is a way of looking at the world. It's based on a set of assumptions and principles, and everything gets built upon those assumptions. So if we were to go back and look at what is the problem today, there's certain false assumptions. I mean, they are provably false. One is most people and most economic systems really look at human labor as the only way that human beings can contribute legitimately to production. That this is a basic way of producing. They'll say it's my human labor, your human labor. Okay. And that means whether it's manual or it's intellectual or scientific, we would call that all a human labor as a simplification. However, what's happening, and this now the people in the World Economic Forum are acknowledging this, is that you have advanced, technologies, robotics, artificial intelligence, many forms of technology that do things faster and better than human beings in terms of production, economic production. Now, if we stay in this framework that it's only really labor that's important, even though you have this massive displacement of human beings in terms of economic work, if you depend on your labor income and you suddenly are no longer needed, then where's your income going to come from? And it can only come from, a couple of ways. One is government can redistribute, people may give you charity, or you turn to, crime, stealing. Okay. We're saying that assumption is false, and we got to rethink things in terms of how each human being can legitimately produce, because you must produce if you're going to consume, or someone's got to produce for you to consume. So we look at these tools that people have been building over thousands of years, but they became special kinds of tools around the Industrial Revolution, that suddenly you have these capital tools that can create massively and much more rapidly, and they can even create other capital tools, and you need less and less human labor involved. So then the question is, okay, we can ignore what's happening with technological development, or we can say, look, isn't it wonderful? Human beings have come up with these ways that you don't have to be, working out in the assembly line, for example, or working in the coal mines or backbreaking work in the fields. If they own tools, technologies that can do these things faster and better, but we can get the income from them by owning shares, particularly in companies that use these tools, then that becomes a new source of income for us, and giving us the free time, the what Aristotle called leisure time, to do the higher pursuits, the higher work of humanity, which includes going into religion, doing work for the common good.
How about time to think?
Yes, time to think. Exactly. And I think that's really important.
So, something a lot of people don't do today.
Exactly. So we have this great possibility, but people don't even think of in this way. Economists they'll say, no, of course, there's more than one factor of production. You got labor, capital, land, intellectual, blah, blah, blah. Well, we can say, all right, how is the income distributed? And economists, when they start looking at how are we going to grow, the economy, they have to worry about consumption, where most people are going to get their incomes, either by creating jobs that aren't needed or raising minimum wage levels when maybe a company can't afford to do that, or have the government come in and take from the super billionaires. This is universal basic income. Yeah. The income they get from owning these advanced technologies. And that's, by the way, one of the reasons that their wealth grew while others shrunk.
That all was also built on this false economy. So we're still standing on this house of sort of sand, And as I read your book, I feel like I'm in a poker game with very experienced players who know how to manipulate the table, read the cards, and study the gestures and the behavior of all the other players.
Yes, it's rigged.
The book is The Greater Reset, Reclaiming Personal Sovereignty Under Natural Law. Be sure to tune in to part 2 of our conversation. Hey, if you made it this far, thanks for listening. Tune in on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe. Join our mailing list at thefocusingway.com.